In an era when kingdoms were forged by the sword and glory measured by the number of battles fought, not the number of laws, a king emerged who was immortalized not for his rule, but for his warfare. Richard the Lionheart, King of England, who rarely sat upon his throne, yet etched his name in the annals of wars and the Crusades in blood and fire. A commander who confronted Saladin, terrified the kings of Europe, was captured like any ordinary knight, and then returned to shift the balance of power once more. Was he a legendary hero who saved the Latin East from collapse, or a king who squandered a historic opportunity, leaving his kingdom to pay the price for his absence? This is not the story of a king, but the tale of a warrior born for war, who lived for it and who died for it. Welcome to this new video in our series on the greatest kings in history. The man history would come to know as Richard the Lionheart was born on September the 8th, 1157, into one of the most complex ruling families of medieval Europe. He was the son of King Henry II, ruler of England and the vast Angevin Empire, and Eleanor of Aquitaine, an extraordinary woman who combined political acumen with power and influence. She brought the Duchy of Aquitaine with her marriage, making the Plantagenet dynasty masters of lands stretching across both sides of the English Channel. Richard grew up in a world of contradictions. English royalty and French nobility, a formal loyalty to the French crown, and a constant struggle for power. He was not destined to inherit the throne from the outset, as older brothers preceded him, but the twists of fate and bloody family feuds changed everything. His mother raised him, and he received an education befitting a warrior prince. He excelled in the arts of war, mastered Latin, and possessed a literary and musical taste rarely seen among the kings of his time. At the age of 14, he was granted the Duchy of Aquitaine, and it was there that his true character began to take shape. He soon found himself embroiled in internal rebellions against his father and alliances with the kings of France, fighting his first battles before he turned 20. His ruthlessness in suppressing rebellious nobles in southern France earned him a fearsome reputation and cemented his image as a merciless warrior, to the point that he became known as the Lionheart. He was tall, powerfully built, handsome, and fiercely self-confident. He loved glory and war and surrounded himself with poets and singers. Yet, at the same time, he was quick to anger, harsh in his ways, and did not hesitate to destroy castles and subdue his enemies with fire and iron. Despite his late marriage to Berengaria of Navarre, he had no heir, which opened the door to debate about his private life, a debate that historians have yet to definitively resolve. The family conflicts did not subside even after the deaths of his brothers, one after another, as Richard soon found himself facing the ambitions of his younger brother John and his father's favoritism towards him. Feeling Aquitaine under threat, he forged a decisive alliance with the French king Philip II in the last rebellion against Henry II. The conflict ended with Richard's victory and his father's death in 1189, making him the undisputed heir to a vast empire. He was crowned King of England in September of the same year, during a brief visit to the country whose crown he now held, a visit that seemed like a mere footnote in his life. Richard, finally victorious over his enemies and his own family, was not preparing for a peaceful reign, but rather for a greater adventure, a war that would take him far beyond Europe to a new theatre that would forever immortalize his name. The call came from the east, from Jerusalem and the Crusader states crumbling under the blows of a unified Islamic power. Since the late 11th century, Christian Europe had been engaged in protracted wars known as the Crusades, aimed at reclaiming the Holy Land lost to the Muslim conquests of the 7th century. Despite centuries of relative coexistence, the balance of power shifted with the rise of the Seljuks, and then with the emergence of an exceptional leader who united Egypt and Syria under one banner, Saladin. In 1187, disaster struck. The Crusaders were defeated at Hattin, Jerusalem fell, Europe was shaken, and calls for aid to the east grew louder. Richard had already made up his mind. The cross was not only a religious duty, but also a stage for personal glory. Upon ascending the throne, he set about preparing the Third Crusade, raising funds by imposing the tithe of Saladin and consolidating his empire, leaving England in the hands of William Longchamp, deliberately ignoring the ambitions of his brother John. In the summer of 1190, Richard set sail with King Philip II of France. They parted ways en route, and Richard chose the sea. The voyage took him to Sicily, where he rescued his sister Joan and forcefully imposed his authority on its ruler, Tancred. Then the storm carried him to an unexpected turn, Cyprus. There, when the island's governor miscalculated, Richard moved swiftly, conquering the entire island with a single blow, achieving the campaign's greatest and most enduring victory. In Limassol, he finally married Berengaria of Navarre in a solemn ceremony without an heir. Richard reached Acre in the summer of 1191, after a long siege. With his arrival, the city's resistance crumbled, and it fell in July. Philip withdrew to France, leaving Richard as the sole commander of the campaign. But the victory was tainted by a bloody shadow. Thousands of Muslim prisoners were executed near Acre, an act that remains a subject of moral and historical debate to this day. Richard led his army south along the coast to face Saladin at the Battle of Arsuf. There, despite his opponent's numerical superiority, his heavy cavalry decisively won the battle, securing his most significant field victory on the road to Jaffa. Yet the ultimate goal, Jerusalem, remained elusive. Leaders wavered, ranks fractured, and resolve was torn apart by conflicting plans. By 1192, momentum had waned. Internal strife, the assassination of Conrad of Montferrat, Saladin's temporary capture of Jaffa, and news of conspiracies in Europe, led by John, all forced Richard to accept reality. A truce was signed with Saladin. The coast from Acre to Jaffa remained in Crusader hands. Freedom of pilgrimage to Jerusalem was guaranteed, but the city itself remained outside his grasp. Richard left the east in October 1192. He had not recaptured Jerusalem, but he had shifted the balance of power, seized Cyprus, and cemented his reputation as the greatest warrior of his age. However, the journey was far from over. His return to Europe marked the beginning of a new chapter, no less perilous than the wars in the East, where conspiracies awaited him in the heart of the continent. Richard the Lionheart's return from the East was no less perilous than his campaigns in the Holy Land. He found himself surrounded by hostile princes, foremost among them Leopold, Duke of Austria, an ally of Emperor Henry VI, and Richard's bitter enemy. The English king attempted to slip through Europe disguised as a returning pilgrim, accompanied only by a few of his most loyal men, but fate betrayed him. His ships were wrecked off the coast of Istria, suspicions arose, and he was captured near Vienna in December 1192 and imprisoned in Dornstein Castle. News quickly reached Emperor Henry, then Philip of France, who saw Richard's capture as a golden opportunity, and Prince John, who immediately plotted against the throne. However, the European Church considered the capture of a returning crusader a grave crime and exerted immense pressure for his release. After arduous negotiations, Richard was freed in exchange for a huge ransom and military pledges. He did not leave Germany until early 1194, more than a year after his departure from the East. Richard returned to England in March 1194, encountering little resistance. He quickly suppressed the rebellion of John's supporters and reclaimed his crown and prestige. France, not England, was the true heart of his empire. There, the conflict transformed from an internal war with his brother into open confrontation with King Philip of France. Within a few months, with the help of his allies, Richard had recovered most of his Normandy and Aquitaine possessions, once again demonstrating his military genius. But this victory was not permanent. Truces and wars followed one after another. Alliances shifted until the conflict reached its peak in the late 1190s. With the construction of the formidable fortress of Gaillard, Richard seemed to have reached the zenith of his power, forcing Philip to retreat with the Treaty of 1196. However, the peace remained fragile. War resumed and intensified, and Europe witnessed complex alliances formed against Richard's rise. By 1198, Richard had recovered most of his territories and left France in its weakest position in decades. Then, ironically, in a rare moment of peace, death came unexpectedly. In the spring of 1199, he was struck by an arrow while suppressing a minor local rebellion. The wound became gangrenous, and he died in April at the age of 42. He was buried in Fontevraud. John succeeded him, and the decline of the Angevin Empire began. Richard's legacy, however, remained paradoxical. A king who spent most of his reign at war, with little interest in administration, yet who revived the Crusader cause when it was on the verge of collapse, halted Saladin's advance, and ensured the survival of the Crusader states for another century. Thus, the Lionheart remained more of a military legend than a statesman, a hero of the sword, not of governance, and a stark example of a king who forged his glory on the battlefield and later paid for it with his kingdom. Don't forget to subscribe. See you next time.